This is the 26th episode of the podcast Scary Thoughts for Philosophy Culture. My name is Marc Kate. I'm co-producer and co-host, and
I'm Chad Lott.
And let's go down. Meg Elison.
I'm Meg Elison.
Please give us a little bio. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Chad, you want to take it back, or are you good?
Jesus, do I want to take back?
Do you have anything to add to your bio? You just want to say your
this
name?
is everything anyone needs to know about me. That I'm here producing the show with Marc, and after that, I just go home and go to sleep.
It's pretty good. You just go back to your closet. Yeah, all right. So, my name is Meg Elison. I'm a science fiction and horror writer. My books are available right here at Borderlands if you'd like to pick them up. I wrote 2014's Philip K. Dick Award-winning The Book of the Unnamed Midwife and its sequel, The Book of Etta, which came out this year. I have short stories all over on the internet. I can't stop saying things. Follow me on Twitter.
Hi, and I'm Jeremey Lassen. I've worked at Borderlands Books for coming on 20 years now. I was the first employee here at Borderlands. And in addition to being a bookseller at a science fiction horror specialty bookstore, I ran a publishing company called Nightshade Books, and was editor-in-chief and published and edited a lot of horror and science fiction and fantasy, and big Stephen King dork. So that's all you need to know about me.
But we're all big Stephen King dorks, right?
I guess that goes without saying.
We don't need to say that part.
And while we're talking bios and such, either of you have anything to plug, anything coming up that we need to know about?
I have a story in the November-December issue of Fantasy and Sci-Fi magazine, of which I am quite proud. I would definitely like to plug that.
Nightshade Books just had a really great supernatural thriller come out called The Brimstone Files, X-rated. It's sort of True Blood meets The Rocky Files. It's really cool.
And we do, most of you probably know, Scary Thoughts podcast, so we're on @scarythoughts.podcast at Instagram, which we do surprisingly uplifting messaging on that Instagram account. So there's a lot of horror in the world, and we try to make it a little bit brighter, at least our intern does. And I guess we'll start.
Well, actually, we have another plug. Next episode, we're going to be covering Raw, the French movie from last year. Very excited to be covering that. And just a quick thing for all of you, spoilers. Okay, actually, who of you have seen the new movie, the new It?
Excellent. Thank you.
And how many of you read the entirety of the book?
Hang your heads in shame, please.
Who read it in the 80s?
And we're not going to talk about the 1990 version made-for-TV movie. So, where do we want to start?
Well, I'll just start off. I actually, despite a lot of other critics' opinion of it, I loved it. I thought it was great. I'm usually really upbeat on this sort of stuff, whereas Marc is always dreary and an upset world. I try to be a little bit of a color commentator, but I thought it was a great movie for what it was for me. Like, I got super stoned, saw it Friday night at the Alamo, and it was just, it was exactly what I needed for Friday night. Is it the best movie ever? Probably not. But is it the best Stephen King adaptation? Probably not. But it was super fun for a Friday with all these lovely people.
Now that I've had a little time to think about it and some distance from the film, I've let go of some of my initial rage about it, which is really helpful for actually discussing something in an analytical mode. I was disappointed with it, as I've been disappointed with almost every adaptation of a King movie. It has the usual failures. It cuts out a lot of what I thought was most beautiful and most important to the narrative. But I think even when you truncate a book that's a doorstop at 1,200 pages, you can get something really great out of it. And in this case, we got something at least really terrifying that resonates with audiences, that brought in just truckloads of money. It's obviously a really enjoyable film, and for the most part, my function on this panel will be to facilitate feminist criticism, specifically on the role of Bev, which is a big focus for me, both in rereading the book and in looking at the way she was treated in this film.
I gotta go with everybody else. I love the movie. I love this adaptation. Big fan of the novel. And I also agree when you're adapting a huge doorstop like that, there's not a lot of ways for a filmmaker to make everyone happy. But I feel like this movie was very successful in what it kind of explicitly set out to do within, the confines of the screenplay and the characters it presented. It seemed like it was really successful, and from a technical / craftsmanship level, the jump scares were jumpy, and the moodiness, it all came together in a really kind of upscale way that you don't normally see on on what is ostensibly a schlocky horror film. I don't know. I thought it all came together really well.
I feel like one thing that everybody seems to be talking about online and in reviews and everything is about what it got right and what it got wrong relative to Stephen King's specific book or his universe and all that. And oftentimes it's just sort of a comparison that's not very interesting. But what do you guys think is particularly difficult in, we have this long legacy of adaptations of Stephen King material now, like a lot to draw from, and most of them are pretty terrible, I mean, by anybody's standards. But what do you guys think is not what this movie got in particular as a movie of the book, but as a Stephen King adaptation?
I think one of the things that this film did really well was it picked up on many of the visual references and affinities with other Stephen King films. I think when I was watching it, I could definitely see the influence of Stand By Me, taken from his short story, The Body. I could see the influence of even The Shining. I mean, there's no horror director alive who didn't take something from Kubrick. So I think if you look at it as a part of a Stephen King cinematic universe as opposed to a Stephen King literary universe, there's probably more to enjoy there because it feels more of peace. I think if you look at it as an adaptation of the novel or in the firmament of these novels, what's missing is the things that don't translate to screen well no matter who's in charge. We lose the cosmic horror, we lose the ineffable, which frankly sits at the heart of this story. But in a family of movies, there's a lot there.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that it captured perfectly from the novel is the sense of childhood alienation from the larger adult world. I mean, the movie almost functioned like a Charlie Brown episode. The only adults could have been speaking in the wah 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 voice for all that they added to moving the plot forward or changing things. It was a movie about the kids, and it was about their perception of the wider world and how terrifying that was. And that was roughly half of the novel, and it got that half, just nailed it perfectly.
Yeah, I really liked the move to being from the 50s to the 80s. I thought it was really kind of a smart thing, because we were talking about this on our Rocky Horror Picture Show episode, that when Frankenberg says whatever happened to Fay Wray, probably no one knows who Fay Wray is anymore, especially that new adaptation that came out. So a lot of the things that Stephen King's referencing in it, I Was a Teenage Werewolf and all these weird schlocky 50s movies, they're not going to resonate to people who grew up in the 80s, like probably a lot of us did. And so I thought a lot of that movement was really smart. And I liked how a lot of the camera work keeps things at kids level, like parents and adults are often shot from below, and it contributes to just the feeling of childhood wonder and fear that happens in that environment. I think though the one thing that was missing from that though is the Barrens get really short shrift. It's this area where the kids go to be kids. I think anybody who grew up in kind of a suburban 80s environment probably knows that area of the woods where you just find some dirty porn magazine and a mattress and pieces of bicycles and maybe somebody asleep. And that was such a big part of the book, but wasn't so much here, and it gets replaced by the haunted house, which is, to me, the corniest change, I think.
I agree with the prudence of moving it from the 50s to the 80s, because like you said, most of the references would have been lost, and it's impossible for audiences today to see the 50s as anything but kitsch. But I think they kept a lot of that small town feel that even in rural Maine wouldn't have been possible in the 80s. If you think about Mike delivering parcels of meat to a butcher from the farm on his bicycle, the FDA was a thing in the 80s. He tried to keep a lot of the blamelessness and the innocence to the story that really wouldn't have been possible in the decade. So you're right, some of it just didn't land right, moved into the 80s.
Well, to speak your point about taking out that piece of the Barrens and that piece of childhood, I think it was part of the focusing in the movie on the fears of childhood. And because there was so much of the book that was set up to the setting up the bucolic, running in the Barrens and building the dam and all these pieces of childhood that were positive. And I feel like for a very, short, focused movie, they kind of entirely got rid of that. There was a little bit of a hint of it when they went to the quarry, but that also served a plot and character development point in a way that kept the movie focused on not the things that made childhood wonderful, but the things that made childhood terrifying. And so by excising that kind of safe space of the Barrens, it almost upped the stakes a little bit in the context of the movie. It was like there was no safe space of the Barrens.
Yeah, how good were the villains? The bully kids, the 80s bully kids are so good. In the when you look at the 90s version, you basically get 3 Fonzies coming to attack them, and it's not scary at all. But in this one, you get that redheaded kid, and there's nothing worse than a mean redheaded kid when you're 12.
With a mullet.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
So
I
good.
really wanted to see the casting notice for those bully parts, because seriously, they're please be an over-muscular 16-year-old male with a nose like a ski jump and a really embarrassing haircut. How the hell do you even get those kids? They have bully faces, they were bred to be bullies.
Yeah, I was thinking Ginger Joffrey that works out a little bit.
Yeah. If anybody's ever told you look like Scott Farkas from A Christmas Story,
Yeah, the ultimate bully.
right?
Yeah.
Well, what do you think that it as a movie and separately it as a book focuses on in particular about a sort of collective dread? Thinking about the ways in which horror is really spiked to be representative of its own time, and what collective fears are they manifesting? Because it seems that the book goes in 20 different directions and goes completely off the rails. It goes cosmic horror to a certain point, whereas the movie is really sort of bullies, clown.
Yeah.
That's it. But it engineers clown as being a sort of generic ability to do jump scares, which I think most people above a certain age are super anti-jump scare, but I feel like this movie in particular really nailed what a jump scare is for and when it can be brought out at its best. And then Pennywise was kind of just a vehicle for that film technique. And wasn't necessarily about some sort of collective fear we all have as a culture.
So I think one of the things that the book nails best is the idea that what happened to you in your past does not go away. You grow up, you move out, you develop your career, you change who you are. In Mike's case, you shed a ton of weight. In Bill's case, you become successful at the only thing you ever wanted to do, and yet your hometown will find a way to drag you back and make you into what you used to be. It does a really deft job of moving existential horror of adulthood into primeval horror of childhood. I think the movie really focused on some interesting themes that weren't present for me in the book, when they realized that they're placing missing persons posters over missing person posters, that you're being forgotten, that you'll go missing and then you won't matter anymore, or even showing us Betty Bowers in the house on Neibolt Street, who's only half there and pleading for help and no one can help her. It traded more on the feeling of helplessness and of lostness than I think the book ever did. And I think they chose that because kids today are so conditioned to the fear of strangers that they would resonate with it more than they would resonate with, say, building a dam in the Barrens, because that's not a thing that kids do anymore. I mean, even the fact that we saw them as free as they were on their bicycles without adult supervision was pretty unusual.
I mean, it seems that Eddie's mother is another representation of that, and I don't know how that plays out in the book, but Eddie's the kid who's a hypochondriac because of his mom, who also is, or instills it in it, is that is another sort of manifestation of this fear of the outer world, the fear of what's out there, and the sort of resignation that there's nothing one can do about it.
Yeah, in the book, Eddie and Stan both kind of stand in for the first inklings of adult horror, since Eddie is suffering from Munchausen's by proxy, if you want to just lay it out there. And Stan is the one who, and this is excised in the film and I was so disappointed, Stan is fundamentally offended that his knowledge of the universe and his notion of how things should work has been changed. He's not upset that there are clowns in the sewer. He's upset that magic exists and nobody told him.
Yeah, there are things about that character that I think are super funny in the film, that his character always puts his kickstand down on his bike.
Yes.
It's just an awesome little nod. And for me, Richie Tozier is the standout of this film. That kid, who ruins every single happy or sweet moment I relate to so much.
No, I also think they gave Eddie one of the best funny moments when he comes to realize that his, big spoiler, his medications are all placebos, and he comes to accuse his mother and says, "These are gazebos!" Like, there's some really good moments of levity that are mostly facilitated by Richie's character, but every once in a while you get to spread them around. And that's a nice move, too, because in the book they're all funny. They're all cut-ups. Also, I love how many children swear in this movie. I would like to see more children swearing copiously and recklessly. Like, I remember swearing when I was 11. Like, I just learned that you could use the word son of a bitching. I'm going to use that every day now.
Well, something that comes up on Scary Thoughts a lot, I feel like, is that there is this line with horror that is drawn where now that everybody has a mobile device on their person, if you are lost alone, like horror has to confront that you are not alone, that you have a lifeline to the real world, and that I'm out of juice, I can't get any bars, the killer broke my mobile phone. But if you go back to the 80s and before, there's no lifeline. If you are alone in the woods, you don't even have to accommodate for that lifeline. You're just alone, and I think that that is deeply connected to why there are so many horror films that are set in the 80s and before still. It's kind of retro, but it also solves an awful lot of problems, because when you're alone, you are alone, and there's no hope beyond your wits against the killer. And in this movie, there's also this other element compounded that a lot of horror movies don't do, which is the freedom that children used to have. That, I mean, I can't say that no kids have it any longer. You know, it's a big world with lots of different parenting skills and styles. But these kids have an absolute freedom that I think the four of us probably were raised with, and at least the families that I know, I do not see that in anybody's upbringing that I know.
Well, it's a very interesting juxtaposition because of the subject matter of the movie is about kids getting kidnapped and murdered.
Yeah.
And that cultural archetype, or that fear, has so infused parenting that I feel like not only is the movie very focused on the fears of childhood and the things that scare us, but the focusing on those lost child posters and the one after the other kind of get to that core of the helicopter parenting. Somebody's right outside that door right now waiting to steal my child.
Yeah.
Like, is a real thing for parents, and that's why we see so much of that parenting style, because it's bludgeoned into us by the media. I mean, there were just as many kids kidnapped and killed and murdered per capita back in the day, 100 years ago, 50 years ago. There just wasn't ubiquitous media telling us about it. And small towns were just as dangerous as the big towns. There was just more media to tell us about it and tell us to be afraid about it. And so I think that this movie does an incredible job of juxtaposing that freedom of, that 80s bucolic suburban childhood with the driver that chased that culture away, these missing children.
I think the film does a really good job in just a few short scenes of explaining to us why that the culture hasn't shifted. Like, even though we know that kids are disappearing by, 8 times the national average, we get to see people intentionally look away. Like, we see that couple who are seeing, Ben's getting knifed up on the side of the road. They're like, nothing to see here, move along. Like, it shows us the presence of those red balloons and just the weird small town ignorance that allow it to prosper.
And the murder of Georgie right up front.
Yeah.
The first scene is
she watches the whole time.
Yeah,
but she doesn't do anything.
Maybe they're just not that into kids in this town. It's like San Francisco.
Somebody keeps snatching them, but there's still more dogs than there are kids here.
So, Meg.
Yes.
I feel like you came with an agenda, and now's your time.
I appreciate you giving me this moment. Thank you.
Unleash the bevening.
So here's the bevening. I was here last week. There was a joint launch for Seanan McGuire, who's a mostly urban fantasy writer, and Sarah Gailey, who recently just published her second novella about the population of wild hippos that was almost released into the American river system, and it's called Taste of Marrow. You should definitely read it if you haven't. And the minute I arrived, Shauna McGuire and I picked up on a conversation that we'd been previously having on Twitter because we both walked out of it with the exact same rage in our hearts. She and I both grew up reading this book. It was like a Bible to us. That's not an exaggeration. Like, it literally gave us part of our early cosmology of how we thought the world really worked. I think Stephen King is that for a lot of people. And I think he was that for more girls than he knew he would be. So, Beverly Marsh, the one girl among the losers, the Smurfette of this tale. In the book, Bev is a hero. Bev is the marksman of the group. They give her their silver bullet. They give her the slingshot. They give her a chance to show off that she's a better shot than any of them. When it comes to fighting the monster, Bev is the final girl. The movie, this version of the movie, and the 1990 miniseries, which apparently we're not talking about, to a lesser extent, strip Bev of a lot of her agency. This version in particular sees her actually kidnapped so that the boys have a rallying point and something that they can bond over and say, this is a bridge too far. They cannot take our girl. There are some cinematography choices with which I was very uncomfortable. For example, everybody else is just standing there in a lumpy diaper looking over into the quarry. And Bev shows up and disrobes in slow motion in very good lighting as a barely pubescent female. It's one thing for us to know that the boys in the film are ogling her and it's perfectly natural, and it's another thing for us to say, hey audience, ogle this girl. I was a little upset by that. I was upset that she got Princess Peached and they had to go find her in another castle. I was upset that in the final fight it was Richie with a baseball bat, apropos of nothing, not part of the catechism of childhood, of believing in the power of your slingshot, of your silver bullet. I was particularly upset that she spends a good portion of the film as a literal object, floating, unconscious. And the way that we fix that is we have a boy kiss her while she's unconscious, which is a thing that heroes do. I know we're all tired of hearing it, but the way that women are objectified in horror films is an ongoing problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem as long as we say, well, she was the bravest one and she jumped into the quarry first. Doesn't that prove that she's a strong female character? No, it motherfucking does not. I really wanted a lot better for Bev. Side note, I wanted better for Mike, who used to be an interesting character because he knew the town's history, and he was specifically the victim of oppression in his town because he was black. And this version of the film took almost everything away from Mike that was unique or interesting about him and gave it to Ben for no discernible reason. And those of us who grew up reading Stephen King know that he has problems with his treatments of non-white characters and of female characters, but that it hasn't always been that bad. And I think they took a problematic book and some problematic characters and made it worse in this film. So that was my initial rage. Join me in my raging. There's good in this, and I'm able to see that there's good in this. I think they did a pretty feasible job of building the bonds between the losers and showing how each of them has a strength and helps each other out. But in the end, it was not fair to Bev or Mike.
I agree, Mike. It was a real missed opportunity. It was very odd and felt really forced that the kids are beating him up, and the reason for ganging up on this seemingly the only African-American kid in town is get out of town because he's homeschooled or something. It just seems so blind to what that fight would actually be.
Right?
And another thing that you just said is this the slow motion camera cruising across Beverly's body is it definitely posits the camera as being a substitute for the male gaze, which is what it is, and that's how film works, but it's never reversed because the way in which this film's camera operates is it often takes the form of the gaze, like the pharmacist ogling, that's the camera representing the gaze on her body. There is there's the librarian, similar, it's not on a female body, but it's also sort of like the camera as predatory gaze from an adult. And so that is actually the position the camera takes when it's not just following kids riding bicycles.
And I very much agree with your disappointment with those choices and the representation. The one significant change from the book that I was kind of fascinated by from a screenplay standpoint was when they, at the climax, when Pennywise grabs her and tries to scare her, and she says, "I'm not afraid of you." And like her superpower is not being afraid. And there's the abuse and implied sexual abuse from her father, that she has already faced this ultimate evil, or a form of ultimate evil, and she is stronger than that, or she is able to overcome that fear. And one thing that really stuck out to me was one of the changes they made was these kids in this movie are very older than the kids in the book. And the first time we see Bev, she's presented buying tampons. Like, she's coded as an adult, while the boys are coded as kids. And I don't know how much of that was intentional, or the intentionality of saying she is mature, an adult, her lack of fear is tied to that adultness.
I wasn't sure if that was tied to her lack of fear. What I perceived in it was that even if the movie doesn't involve that scene from the book, and it can't, and no version never will, it can still posit women as the gatekeepers of sex and thus of adulthood.
Yeah.
Like, she's already crossed over to pubescence, and so that she can provide that adulthood to them by being a sexual gateway.
Right.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. I overloaded on radio for a second. That's what I wanted to say. I realized about 3 days after seeing the movie why they made her lack of fear her superpower, aside from desperately trying to pump her back into being a strong female character, is that for the boys in this town, the news that something in their home wants to eat them is news. Something's been trying to eat Bev her whole life.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I think that has the best horror scene, I think, though. Like I think the bathroom blood scene is a huge improvement over the 90s miniseries version, and even maybe more overtop than what happens in the book.
Yeah, that scene totally stood out for me, too. And I think it touched on something that you spoke of earlier, about that point in the movie where you are obviously in a different realm. When they filmed that scene showing that blood everywhere in just buckets of it, and the act of having the father come in and not see any of it was such a, we're through the looking glass now. And then when she brings, the rest of the losers in, and they experience that, all the adults here don't see any of this. Like, for me, that was that turning point in the movie where it was such a great visual scene, an allusion to so many different horror movies, be it Carrie or The Shining or a bunch of other possible visual references, but it was that kind of inflection point where they realized they were on their own, like the dad not seeing it.
And I think it's the biggest point in the movie where you realize there are multiple realities in play.
Yeah.
Not just that you just missed the headless kid and he was here a second ago and maybe you would have seen him, but you're literally not living in the same reality as me.
Yeah.
I feel like I wouldn't have cleaned up the bathroom that adults couldn't see was dirty.
I have read other feminist critics online who point out the importance of that scene, both in the fact that the boys believe Bev when she says that happened, and when they immediately volunteer their labor to help her remediate the situation. That is well handled, and I think it goes more to their bond, even though they use her as a hub and not a spoke, but at least makes them into a team.
So I feel like you guys have read infinitely more Stephen King than I have, but does Stephen King
Everything he's ever written. Every word.
That's bananas to me. Does Stephen King blame parents for everything and everything he writes?
No, sometimes he blames religion.
Which is kind of like parents.
I think Stephen King has a more adversarial view of the parent-child relationship than most people do, having had an absentee father and an ambivalent relationship with his mother. He grew up not the apple of anybody's eye and not anybody's pride and joy, and that's a different experience than most writers who come from typically a more privileged class. I think it's very important to remember that Stephen King is a blue-collar writer. Like, he cut his teeth in industrial laundries and in shitty jobs, and it really changes the way... I mean, poor people don't want to be bad parents, they just don't have the time or the resources to do any better, and that's what he came from. And I think those are typically the parents that he writes.
If you read On Writing, his book it's about a third biography, and the first third of it is really interesting. It's strange to me that he wrote such a sweet Georgie Bill relationship when his relationship with his brother was so fucked up. Like there's one point where his brother makes an electromagnet out of an exposed extension cord and a nail, and he has Stephen King plug it into the wall, which I think might explain a lot.
I think that's why in his stories the brother is always dead.
Yeah. Revenge.
Yeah, for those of you who haven't read On Writing, even if you're not a writer, it is a worthwhile memoir of if you want to figure out how to fuck up a kid and turn them into a horror author. All the instructions are there.
And it's also this great moment where he kind of says, yeah, I was an alcoholic and a raving coke addict, and I wrote like 5 or 6 novels I don't even remember writing, and I was just like, that's amazing. Like that is the most rock star thing ever.
It is the most rock and roll thing. And then he turns right around and gives the credit for his recovery to his wife, who did dump out all of his bottles of cocaine envelopes on his desk and say, figure this shit out or I'm leaving and taking your children.
So was it one of those books?
No, that period accounts for the Tommyknockers, Cujo, and there was one other book in there. He says he has no memory of writing. Yeah, I think Christine's too early.
Is it?
No.
Christine came out just before this one.
Tommyknockers is weird as shit. I can believe he doesn't remember that.
Because it does seem to be that sort of mega work that, I mean, maybe it's like if you do enough cocaine for long enough, it sort of like rewires you a little and you're just that guy now. And I sort of feel like it has just so much fucking packed into it. Like every monster, cosmic or real. It's even got clowns. Like it's just so like, well, I know and.
It did read to me like he had a book, nonfiction book called Dance Macabre.
Yeah.
And it was like a fictional catalog of those things, of like, these are my childhood, these EC comics, these monster movies.
Yeah, the MGM monster movies. And part of it is a love letter to the schlock horror of the 50s because it did help shape him. But I think he had an early cosmic experience of one type or another, some consciousness expanding moment, possibly through injury, possibly through drug use, that heavily influenced works like It and The Stand and The Dark Tower, so that he started thinking about a vast interconnected set of universes as opposed to doing the little piddly shit that most horror writers do, like Haunted Houses.
Yeah, it's borderline Terrence McKenna territory.
Yeah, it's almost Terrence McKenna. If you've read any of the great druggy sages, Stephen King has a lot in common with them.
And actually, I wanted to kind of circle back around to, because that does kind of touch on, we were talking about how much of a leftist politics are part of King's revoir. And the novel, is really founded in the opening act is this act of homophobia, and there's both in the 50s and 80s the cultural hatreds, be they racial or gender-based or religious-based, there's this really great snapshot of Sam's wife and her kind of experience with anti-Semitism and that's the opening of it. Our first shot of all these characters are, this is what we experience every day. This form of racism, this form of misogyny, this form of, it's all right there. The opening statement from every character deals with some form of
real oppression.
Yeah. And that's why I think it's such a mixed opportunity that the film totally walked away from that with the character of Mike, and because it was so intrinsic in the book, and I think that's my biggest disappointment is how it just totally walked away from that portion of it.
I'm sorry about that.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of filmmakers these days are facing the choice of either sidestep this issue or do it imperfectly and face the wrath of the internet, and that many of them are choosing the coward's path, frankly, and saying, I'm just not going to touch this.
Well, it seems that there are to my mind, 4 things that this adaptation left in the dust. One is the social politics of the original, and the other is, so the 4 of us actually went to go see it together, and then we all went got drinks, and the question came up of whether or not there has, I don't remember how it was phrased, but the idea of, has there actually been a film about cosmic horror? Has cosmic horror as an idea actually been embodied in cinema? I think it's hard because cosmic horror doesn't really look like, what does that look like? You can write about it a lot more easily than you can fund a multi-million-dollar film about it that doesn't involve kick punching, you know? So, but, and this, at least the first half of this movie, if we assume that this is only gonna have 2 parts as a movie, it erased a lot of the politics and it erased the cosmic horror from the book. And I wonder if part 2 will be both of those. The part 2 could start with, what was the name of the bar? The
Black Spot.
The Black Spot.
If the first scene is the Black Spot being burned down, and then we
With
just
the
go
Klan
straight
outside.
cosmic horror, yeah. If it's like Klansman cosmic horror, it's suddenly like everything else that made the book interesting, right?
That could happen.
Could
and
happen,
I want to believe that's going to happen. Like, I want to believe Santa Claus is coming, you know?
Yeah, I know.
But I feel like there were a lot of opportunities to plant suggestions of that throughout chapter 1, and having seen it twice now, I think that those plantings just don't exist. I mean, there are 2 mentions in the film of the turtle. There's a Lego turtle on Jodie's nightstand that's just smashed for no reason, and then they encounter a turtle when they're swimming at the quarry. And those of you who've read the book know that the turtle is a major cosmological figure, a god or something like a god, a beam guardian for sure. And in both of those instances, it gets no weight. It just slips away. There's a beat on something
clearly
else.
the director was telling you by smashing the turtle, look, we got rid of the turtle. Like a great moment where they're just like, we need to tell the hardcore It fans, no turtles.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be any like really major elements of cosmic horror in the sequel, because so much of that cosmic horror feel manifest in like H.P. Lovecraft books is like just the dirtiness of the town. And a lot of the things we just talked about that are social problems, like the gay bashing or the racist burning of a black bar, they all demonstrate like there is a town where all things that are shitty happen. And that is supposed to be because of the corruption and some sort of cosmic entity that lives underneath it. And since Derry wasn't such a major player in the film, I don't think we'll see that later. I mean, you get like the dead lights a little bit in Pennywise's mouth.
It really disturbed me that we saw the deadlights for a few seconds and there was no remarking upon it. That it has no meaning.
I mean, that's what we
Well,
get.
it was just like the Lego turtle.
Right,
It was like a little throw out to the people who would recognize it, but the people who didn't read the book, like that, you know, when, you know, the deadlights make Bev go limp and float like everybody else. That was actually one visual thing that I actually loved, was like literalizing the you'll float, with all the missing kids floating up there. I was like, wow, that's a visual creative person, like, making a really great choice in this movie. Like, I was just like, no, Andy, you did a good job on that literally floating choice.
That was a good choice. I think one of you said in the bar the evening after that it seemed almost as though the person who edited the film was unaware of the importance of these symbols and that they just got cut out. Like that maybe they existed, maybe there was some significance to the deadlights, maybe there was a third instance of the turtle and the person cutting the film just didn't know it.
Well, I will say in the movie's defense that one difficulty with horror films I find is answering the question why. Is that something that I find so dissatisfying about most horror films is the question of like, why is this happening? Why is Michael Myers that fucked up? You can't just say because he's crazy. Like, or there's something dead inside, and that's not very satisfying. It's a good horror movie line. You know, it gives fake gravitas. What?
He works in an office environment. It'll drive anyone to murder.
But unfortunately, moving on. Unfortunately, anytime a horror movie does try to stop and explain anything, it gets so tedious so quickly. And the movie adaptation, Pennywise has just like one moment of explanation in the third act, and I'm not remembering what it was, but he just sort of like explains like, you got your kids, you're so delicious, but you're
is
scared.
tasty.
Your tasty
But
beer.
he has almost a paragraph there, and it was like if I was editing that film, that would have gone, and it's actually the only time anything is explained in the movie. I think it's a tricky one, because if they even really tried to explain the deadlights in this movie, it would have just sort of potentially washed so much of the scary.
To speak to your editing point about what may or may not have been cut out. Meg, you and I both spoke about the Pennywise repeating the talismanic
That
punch
drove me nuts.
and he also says something.
So Bill, the character in the book and then the film, has a pronounced stutter, and he has a set of exercises that he uses. So he says to himself, he thrusts his fists against the posts and still insists he sees the ghosts. In the book, this functions as one of the childhood catechisms. It's something powerful he carries with him. It's his form of magic. And in the movie, apropos of fucking nothing, Pennywise starts saying it back to him. It doesn't signify telepathy. It doesn't signify anything powerful about the relationship. The ritual of Chud is not on. He just says it.
And there was one scene where you saw him when he was angsty, kind of repeating that phrase when he was out in the rain. But the Richie character, Pennywise, says something. It says, honk,
Beep, beep, Richie.
Beep, beep, Richie.
Again, apropos of fucking nothing.
And I feel like there was probably other bits of the script that set up Pennywise repeating back their dialogue to them, which may have been, I'm purely speculating, but you and I both were like, what was up with
Where
that?
did that come from? There's
And I feel like if we have the longer director's cut where they get to hang out at the quarry a little bit longer, we'll see that dialogue is in there because he's reflecting back the dialogue that they had amongst themselves as a way of I was there when you had this private moment, or that I'm inside your head. Or...
So in watching it for the second time, I saw even more of those disjointed moments that seem to come from nowhere. So again, in the book, Richie's one of those motor mouth kids who just can't stop talking. They call him trash mouth, and he does really bad impressions. And when they want him to shut up, they tell him beep beep Richie. And that occurs nowhere in this film except that one time when Pennywise uses it. Or there's a moment where the monster is changing forms in the final fight, and he's trying to become the most scary thing to each character. And for a couple of seconds, he's the mummy for Ben Hanscom, which is his chosen monster in the original version, which is one of the 1950s MGM movie monsters. But we never saw it before in this film. It comes literally out of nowhere.
So you're not taking it as it's being intertextual with its own source material. You're just sort of
I mean, it could be it could be intertextual, but it feels to me like lost potential considering how many people who saw the film they lack the text. You can only be intertextual with an audience that has.
But if it was if it was like Iron Man, and there was some oh dude, I have that issue,
Right, or even if he'd switched into one of the New Kids on the Block, give us a reference that we know Ben has some feeling for. But there are just so many of those moments.
Somebody New Kid on the Block.
Right.
Definitely a missed opportunity there.
Because we got that twice, and it could have been our third callback, and it could have turned something innocent and fun into terror.
And I did love the addition of the New Kids on the Block. That was one of the best bits.
So,
we often bring up, in every episode, there's always something that a film does that makes there's always something that makes no fucking sense in a movie. It's just totally a hard left-hand turn, and in this movie it was the blasting the New Kids on the Block on the poster. It had no filmic context in the rest of this movie. It was so disappointing to me.
I don't know. I thought it was a bit of that sweetness that they, it was the first time that Haystack with that Ben and Bev interacted. They interacted over this piece of music, and the first time they're in his bedroom and he's freaking out about it, they did a callback to that. And I thought that was one of the, truly original, non-part of the books that worked really well in the movie. I actually really liked it.
It's a funny moment, and I wonder if more elements of the film could have been Ready Player One a little bit, because a kid that age is going to be afraid of Freddy. He's not afraid of the mummy.
Well, and the Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5 was in the movie theater.
right, and they can mention it on that level, but I'm sure trying to get the rights to Freddy Krueger would have been impossible.
I know.
No.
I just saw in a
It was
trailer.
New
Ready
Line.
Player
They
One.
had the rights.
They owned it.
Yeah.
Okay, yes and no. New Line isn't an own property straight out. There's still some IP issue with the creator.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you think it would have improved it or made it worse if it had nostalgic 80s monsters?
I mean, you'd have had to go back and reintroduce the idea that these kids went and saw movies together and that their first conception of terror came from those movies, and then chose a host of those movie horror figures who could uniquely threaten each one of them, like you're talking about rewriting the film.
I like that it was mostly rooted in parental trauma.
Yeah, I think that was
really strong. Although I never really got Stanley's fear. Bev, super solid.
Absolutely.
Ben, great. Mike could have been better. It deserved more time, but I don't think I get it.
Yeah.
But Stanley, he doesn't want to disappoint his dad.
And he has a
if he
scary
doesn't remember
painting.
the Torah, and he's afraid of a painting.
Yeah, the paintings.
I had that same question. about the painting.
Yeah.
And for me, I mean, it wasn't terribly effective, but it was a reflection of his putting up the kickstand. When the world isn't represented the way it's supposed to be, he finds that disturbing.
Yeah, the scene where he's introduced to his monster does start with him fixing the painting. It's askew, right? He's correcting his view of the world. My problem with that thread is that they dropped it. So he fixes the painting and he pays the price. He fucks up the Torah and he pays the price.
I just think like that painting was a non-representational painting. It was kind of an abstract. And so what he found scary wasn't that it was a creepy woman, it was that it was a non-representational
It was wrong, yeah.
It was, and so I thought like it was a call out to a piece of his character. It just wasn't terribly effective.
Again, you're asking for an intertextual reading when these people have no texts to enter.
Well, no, but he puts the kickstand down, he fixes the painting. Even because he got a really short, he wasn't really well developed. But the little bits we did get was he was very anal.
Yeah, he's anal, and he's characterized as fussy. Yeah. That's super effective. You're right. But I have a really hard time tying it to.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But something that you can look for with that character is that he does have to go through the bar mitzvah, so he sort of technically becomes an adult during the film.
Yeah.
And at the very end, he's the first one to walk away, and so maybe the first to forget what happens. And I think that could be interesting. But then, if you know the story, there's not very much after that for him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's also the first to die, big time spoiler alert, which is what I thought they were trying to signify. If you look at the end of Stand By Me, and I did go back because I saw so much resonance between the two films, when they part after their grand adventure, the first one to walk away is the one that he knows has just died. Like, he counts them back in the order of their mortality.
So what do you guys think about the way, we're kind of backtracking here, but the way in which this movie takes place in the suburbs and book, that, we have just like this epic legacy of like horror in an urban setting, rural horror and everything that represents and how that ties into what our fears as a culture are. But especially in the 80s, there were all these films, and they're what slasher films are based in, is suburban horror. Like the suburbs is in and of itself a horror. Do you think that resonates today, or is that itself a retro concept?
Probably depends on what suburb, right?
Well,
I mean, there are no meth labs in this movie.
yeah, Breaking Bad forever changed the suburbs, right? Now it's suburban noir.
Right.
Or, the Back to the Future 2, where the bad part of town is the suburbs.
Right.
Right.
Like, that's kind of come true in 21st century America.
Yes.
Like, these old suburbs are, Crenshaw, East LA.
Yeah.
Like, that's what the old...
Downtown is now Sex and the City and Friends, just...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. 'Cause I don't have
I also don't think that kids growing up in the suburbs today have anything like the suburban experience that even our generation did, because they live in such a globalized world and they have constant access to anything. I think what really defines the horror of the suburbs is that, in 6 rows of crack houses, no one can hear you scream. These kids have YouTube.
Yeah.
They're not suffering from isolation, and they're not even really suffering in a cultural desert. They can just reach out and get it. So I don't think that the horror of the suburbs can really survive that change, not in the same way.
No, that's a really good point. It kind of captures my feelings about why Pump Up the Volume is a lost narrative that nobody will ever understand who's like younger than us. It's like, wow, he came from the coast and he has access to culture. Like, how does he know this stuff? Sorry for the digression about the suburbs. I was thinking.
Also with the suburbs, I think we're like post-Jackass. Like, I watched this Vice special about where Barnum and Margera is now, and you realize, like, that is the suburbs. Like, just destroying shit with your friends, I think, is what you do. And now that there's been a light shine on that and a potential career path from that.
Well, yeah, it's its own archetypal setting now, much the way like rural horror or big city horror or a clanking castle. 20 years of slasher films have changed like that kind of suburban. You can't have that shot of Haddonfield or insert generic LA suburb.
Or even like Tim Burton's pastel suburbs to serve as a backdrop for Edward Scissorhands. Like even that's
exactly.
not, it doesn't mean the same thing anymore.
Well, it means what it means in the movies. It's taking on its own
its own language.
Its own weight, its own language that is separate from the actual reality of the suburbs.
If it took place in San Francisco right now, where do you think Pennywise's hideout would be?
I mean, the city has tunnels. There's some pretty famous tours that you can go into the city. There's a horrible sewer system that backs up and floods people in, what is it, the Outer Richmond every year? And so you can still get that shit resonance of, living in the bowels of the world. I also think that Golden Gate Park is hella scary at night. And I can see kids being scared out of their fucking minds being over there.
I'd say the Armory.
There's also a lot of...
going in that fucking place.
With all those,
There's a lot of potential for horror on BART and in the tunnels of BART.
Civic Center Station is my pick.
Oh my god.
but the,
Instead of a leper, you have a guy shooting heroin in his veins. It's awful. Sorry.
no, I think he's definitely, Pennywise is definitely out at the old Sutro Baths. Because they've got the tunnels out there that with the door that's locked on this side.
Also, people fall and die out there like on a pretty regular basis.
So definitely I'm feeling like he was haunting the baths.
I dig that.
He burned them down in the 50s. It wasn't an insurance scam, it was something else. I don't know what it was. But something to do with the turtle.
So
Definitely.
not a bar right.
Anybody else got anything they want to?
Yeah. I just wanted to talk about the director, Andy Muschietti, who there's not a lot of deep info about him, but he's an Argentinian director, and he did a movie that was produced by Guillermo del Toro called Mama, and it feels... and a lot of the reviews kind of characterize it as domestic horror, and I feel like that captures a lot of, like, he took what was a cosmic horror story and he turned it into a domestic horror story. It's about that alienation between generations and parents and, and Bev and her father. Like, it's definitely, I think now, just this chapter 1, I don't know what they're going to do in chapter 2, but it's of a domestic horror category. And so maybe he was a really good choice to make this version of it. So, yeah.
What did you guys think of the scares in general? Like, I saw it twice, and I found, like, the first time I was a little altered as was Chad, and I was super susceptible to all those jump scares. Like, I was really vulnerable, and it scared the shit out of me. And then I saw it again, and usually when you see something again, it's not as scary, but I found it was, like, way less scary. And so it really does seem that all those jump scares were really maximized. Like, all the ideas that went into the way that Pennywise manifests were none of them original, but all of them done super well.
Right. Great craftsmanship.
Yeah. But I thought it was interesting that at a time when, I said this earlier, but that we're getting pretty fried out on all these jump scare techniques, and like, it's like horror cinema has had all this time to refine how to progress the soundtrack in just a certain way and how to get the kettle drums exactly when the thing doesn't happen, but then it does, and all that. Like, all these techniques have been like refined, and I feel like this movie is sort of like pushed all of those maybe as far as, I don't know, like maybe we can't do better than this.
Well,
You're gonna do something else now.
Definitely my first reaction to this was like, what an incredibly effective sausage. Like, they just took all the different horror genres and ground it up into like this really tasty sausage.
Yeah.
Like, there was a little bit of like torture porn with the woman talking with her torso gone, that kind of jump scare when they opened up the door. It touched on a lot of different visual cues. And so there wasn't like you would normally say like, oh, well, this felt like this movie or that movie or this genre. This was of a bunch of different.
Well, it was sort of like Cabin in the Woods if you took away the intertextual, self-referential tongue-in-cheekness. If you just did the techniques.
And the political subtext.
Yeah, that's true too. But I was thinking, like, The Hair in the Drain is straight up J-horror,
Yeah. Yeah, and great. I just thank you for bringing up The Hair in the Drain. Like, it's so gross and awesome and icky. Like, that was another part of the the blood out of the drain scene, that was just like, wow, that was so good.
It's highly relatable. Like, we've all had to pull hair out of the drain. It's fucking disgusting.
Yeah.
I had the same feeling about the jump scares, that they were really only good once. You very quickly became desensitized to them if you watch it even a second time. I also found that, let's continue with food metaphors like sausage, I also found that it had kind of a hyper palatability, that it kept trying to hit like the highest possible notes, much like hot Cheetos, which are really spicy and really salty and really greasy and really crunchy, so that kids get accustomed to them and then nothing else tastes like food to them. So the scares in it are really fast and really loud and really dependent on scale and really dependent on closeness, and they're also body horror and they're also hair in the drain horror, and they try to hit every note every time.
Yeah.
So you get desensitized, like you just ate a whole bag of hot Cheetos and be like, I can't taste anything ever again. Like, there's no going back from this. I'm the last person to notice technical details in film. I'm not very attuned to it. And the second time through, especially, I was struck by how bad the sound mixing is. I think in a lot of the jump scares is a big overlay of kettle drums or real overuse of like an ear-splitting sting, because they're just trying to goose you as hard as they can.
And you lose the dialogue.
Oh, absolutely. There was so much dialogue the second time through that I had never heard before.
I think that like that shaky thing that happens in horror movies is like the auto tune of horror.
It is.
It's like comes in.
I will say though that even though upon second watching the jump scares are far less effective, Skarsgård is just fucking great. Like on rewatching, I actually liked him better the second time, because I wasn't so wrapped up in like what the fuck is gonna happen, and just got to sort of see what he was doing physically and with his eyes.
He does a lot of really subtle facial work,
Yes.
which is no small thing when you're wearing a prosthetic like he's got on his head. He's doing a lot of micro movements in his facial muscles, and I can't say enough good things about his performance. Everybody says you can't replace Tim Curry, but Skarsgård did a damn good job.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has really great use of drool.
Apparently that happened just because his prosthetic teeth were actually caused him to drool, and so he just went with it.
Yeah.
He did a yes and. Is anybody, what about you kids? Anybody like have anything to add or
Anything we
ask,
glaringly
or
missed out on?
The lady in the front row.
Right.
Can I, and I don't know if this adds to, it just sort of adds to the discussion a few points back, but maybe isn't a question, but just about like, and I haven't read the book, so speaking to Stanley and being afraid of the painting, I don't know, for me, and then who's the kid who's afraid of clowns? The other
Was
kid?
that Richie?
Richie?
Yeah.
Richie.
Yeah, so compared to Beverly or Mike, you have like these juxtapositions of some kids, I don't know, I thought it was interesting to me where it was like, some kids have privilege and come from, and the scariest thing in their life is painting, like Lucky Stanley. And some kids, watched a bunch of people trapped in a burning building, or their dads abusing them, So I think that to me, it was like, a really nice kind of landscape of what like different kids' experiences might be and what their fears might be.
That's a good point. I had not considered that before.
But that might, not kind of take from the book in a meaningful way. But without knowing the book, that was kind of meaningful and deep somehow.
I found the bullies the most terrifying part of the movie, and I think this idea of domestic horror versus cosmic horror, I really think that it always was a domestic horror, and you see it, in the parents. I think not enough has been talked about the mother of the one who's afraid of the leper.
Eddie.
Yeah.
Eddie's mom was weird the way that they tried to almost mirror that with Bev's dad.
Yeah.
And I don't know how successful that was, because she almost came across as laughable in a way that if you were actually dealing with that situation, would be terrifying.
I think it's interesting, the whole bully situation, because even though Pennywise gets the jump scares and all the special effects and all the best music, there is a sort of containment around it, whereas with bullies, it's like, not like anybody in this room was ever bullied, I'm pretty confident that's but bullies are something you live with, something you grew up with and you never shake, and that is a way of being persecuted personally that we all just sort of walk with, whereas like a clown, you can kind of compartmentalize, but like sociopaths who are out to get you, like, everywhere.
I loved the way the film constructed Henry's relationship with his father and really explained to us how bullies are born. And it was a short but extremely powerful moment of toxic masculinity and how do you turn a kid into a sociopath. And it's so easy to create a bully. Like the 1990 version does this. He just comes out of the ether and he's just bad. And this version of the film is, this is how you get bad kids.
It's his hair pomade.
Well, and to speak to your point about Eddie's mom, I feel like the confrontation with Eddie and his mom in the book was so powerful and effective that I was, it was difficult for me to judge how it came across on scene, because that was one point that just blew me away. Both when he found out about the inhaler and his confrontation with his mom. And it was really presented in the novel of a point where he was growing up by standing up to his mom. And I did get that sense of mirroring with Bev's dad of like these toxic parental figures.
Both of them are trying to gain control of their bodies from their parents. Like there's definitely a parallel there.
But I was so like, the screenplay in that regard was overshadowed by the power of that particular interaction in the book for me. So I wasn't able to really kind of speak to how effective it was. But yeah, definitely that mirroring stood out for me.
Also, it has to be said, Sonia Capsbrack and later Myra Capsbrack, both Eddie's mother and Eddie's wife, Stephen King really hates fat women. And that is played to the hilt in this book. And you got a little bit of it by how much they clown her in her bad sweatsuits in the film, but the fat phobia is real.
I'm curious, Meg, you and I talked a little bit on Twitter about what the director wants to do with Mike's character in part 2, and that's terrifying enough as it is, but I'm curious, what would you like to see in part 2? Like ways to maybe fix some of the problems of part 1, or notes from an adaptation standpoint to hit and try to make it stand out as its own thing?
I mean, for me, they can just not make the sequel. What adults are going to be more charismatic and fun as a group of people?
Yeah.
I mean,
That's going to be tough.
I mean, I feel like ensemble casts kind of aren't a thing as much anymore unless you have like a really shitty one like Suicide Squad. I mean, what do you do? Do you get Will Smith as Mike as an adult? I mean, who knows?
Well, one of the things Michael's referring to is specifically the plan to turn Mike into a drug addict in the second part.
Is that a thing?
That is a thing. I don't know if you guys read the article, but some of the speculation is that our only black character, who is now just the boy with the gun and has lost the rest of his personality, will return as a drug addict because it's the only way he could have coped with what happened to him. No one else is supposed to become a drug addict, by the way.
Yeah, I firmly, if that's my option, I firmly choose like no movie.
Yeah, can we just say no? Yeah.
It's like The Matrix. There's only one Matrix movie.
But that was also Josh Brolin's requirement for a Goonies sequel, was that the older brother would be a drifter. So maybe they got the idea from the unfilmed Goonies sequel.
I mean, I wouldn't call it a hope because it's not going to happen, and they really are up against a brick wall, because something like, it's the problem that the 1990 version had, which is like the first half, or the kids half, everybody remembers that. The adults half, well, it was just a shitty big chill. And the stranger, with Stranger Things and Stand By Me, or Goonies, we have these like really strong ensemble kid casts that it works. And I think that what could be interesting, as much as I totally detest True Detective Season 1, if it went just sort of like a bunch of adults in pure nihilism trying to futilely fight this cosmic horror, that could be really interesting, but I don't think this director's gonna do that. Sequels are almost never as good, so that's another sort of uphill climb. But if they just did the sort of alien to aliens thing of we're just doing something else, this is just a completely different movie now, that could maybe have some potential.
I did like your let's start out like a historical flashback at the Black Spot with the Klan out front and bring all the racism that was in the book.
Needs more representation.
Let's bring that. Let's bring that to the front of the story, and you could keep it then a domestic horror story.
You could.
You could just go with the dairy is the problem.
And you could
it is a manifestation of
and you could
dairy.
give all of them their own brand of adult self-destructive nihilism. The fact that, number one, representation was handled so poorly in this first story, so we don't have any credit to extend to the director. And number two, when he's asked about it, the first thing out of his mouth is, oh, the black kid, drugs. Come on. Yeah.
So it looked like, what do we know about the sequel so far?
Yeah. It's literally the only thing he came up with.
direction.
Right. Not they all have drinking problems, not they've all thrown themselves into mindless sex, but no, this one kid.
Yeah.
We know why.
I mean, this isn't just asking for a spoiler because I'm not going to read the book, but so Beverly's killed her dad. What happened?
So I've heard some argument on the internet as to whether or not Mr. Marsh is dead. It is difficult to reconcile the end of that film because she just says, I'm going to go live with my aunt upstate and everything's fine.
Right. I mean, I thought it was code for
Right? Is Bev a murderer? There's a lot of blood on that floor. I have no idea how we were supposed to read that because the ending makes no sense if he's dead and it doesn't make much sense if he's alive either.
Well, in the book, they don't actually state that, they do state he dies, but they don't state how or why. So in the movie, it was interesting to give her that autonomy and that authority to do that thing. And then we all know that there's a power specifically in that town to forget death, which is why these children keep... So it's actually really plausible for her to kill this guy, similar to Bauer killing his father, and just walk away from it.
That's fine. I hadn't thought of that. Before I had sort of a Schrodinger's molester thing, where it's he's both alive and dead at the same time.
Schrodinger's molester. Yeah, that was Schrodinger's molester. Both alive and
Say that
dead.
louder.
For the record. You said it.
maybe none of the adults can see his blood either.
Yeah, it's we couldn't see his blood either. Okay, she's off scot-free.
Sure.
Anybody else have any thoughts or anything?
Yes. What is your fantasy chapter 2 cast?
That's a good idea. I like fantasy casting.
Yes.
I'm gonna be a wet blanket and say 7 people I've never heard of before, because an ensemble cast, it's gonna get dominated by the big star, and then the screenplay is gonna be focused around the big star.
Amy Adams is a good one. I'd see her. She'd be a good Bev. So would ScarJo as a redhead. I actually think the kid looks a lot like ScarJo. Chris Pine as Big Bill. Zachary Quinto as Stanley.
Yeah. Somebody spent a lot of time thinking about this.
Right, no, it'd be fine if he was gay. One of these kids should be gay. Somebody should get some decent fucking representation.
Well, this is going back to something that we brought up on our episode about Get Out, but there's of course the issue of when Jordan Peele was casting Get Out, and he was actually getting a big budget to do it, and he was like, okay, we've got the budget, we need a star, we need a black guy in this age range, who's going to sell tickets. And that list is really short because Hollywood has not allowed that many of that type of person to come up in this system, and so I hate to be sort of grim about this subject. It's like this is fun, and sorry to sort of make it not fun, but casting Mike, we're throwing out all these amazing Hollywood names, and then okay,
Mike can have nothing.
who's the African American actor?
Who's the guy from Get Out?
Star Wars. Jordan.
Or Jordan Peele, who actually the kid who played Richie. They played this game in an interview I saw, and Richie said Jordan Peele, and he'd be great, but it's all.
But he brings a lot of baggage with him, but he's slightly too old. And you're right, there's almost nobody. John Boyega is a great suggestion. Forgive me, I can't remember the name of the actor from Get Out, but he could absolutely do it. But you're literally looking at a pool of 5 guys.
Well, they're supposed to be in their 40s, which to me, I think but they did him so long with The Dark Tower that they should let him come back and just be like, look, bro, we're sorry for what we did to you in Dark Tower. And it's such a lame movie.
Dark Tower is a whole other rage rant of mine. I could talk about that all day. Dark Tower did give me the idea for my overarching theory of Stephen King adaptations, which I've chosen to describe as Roland's Law. Roland's Law is the better the Stephen King work is, the worse the adaptation will be. Which is why the Dark Tower is the fucking worst.
I
Tell us how you
introduce you.
Yeah, they asked me to do this because I'm so reserved.
You're gonna have to work out Lawnmower Man though.
Ooh, Lawnmower Man.
Let's open up the questions. Related to that, I personally believe that it seems like the better Stephen King adaptations are the ones that most audience members have no fucking idea it's Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
Like Green Mile, Stand By Me, Shawshank. I wonder if you agree or disagree, and why do you think that is, or why you disagree?
I think it is particularly difficult to translate King to the screen because of some of the choices that he makes and some of the things we've talked about. He links mundane horror to cosmic horror. He often engages in unspeakable narratives that we really can't translate to screen. I mean, even the level of violence shown to children in it is relatively new in cinema. It's not something we've been able to do before. But I think more than that, the problem is that it needs to be taken away from him. He can have nothing to do with it. The more King has to do with the movie project, the worse it turns out, and I think anybody who's seen Maximum Overdrive can attest to that.
Oh, we need to just give him a break on that.
Okay, but
That's
so
just like a young man's mistake.
speaking as an author, I think the best thing you can do is to distance yourself from any project of adaptation and say these
He
two
was
works of art.
doing a lot of coke when he made that movie. Like, of course you're gonna say yes when somebody says, "Do you want to make a
But
movie?"
you say yes, and then you
With
throw them the
semis?
door. You say, I'm going to say yes to this, I'm going to sign it over to you, and I'm going to let you make it. And what you make will be an enduring work of art. Like, The Shining is an enduring work of art. It may have very little to do with the source material, but it is a damn good horror film, maybe one of the best of all time. So just get his fucking grubby hands off it, take it away from him, and you'll have a good film.
I actually wanted to answer, I think I have a strong opinion on why the movies that you listed off were successful and seen as such, and a lot of his other work isn't, because they're only marginally fantastic or not fantastic at all. You are allowed to make serious movies with serious budgets and serious actors and serious directors if it doesn't have the fantastic in it. The second you add horror, and now you're schlocky, now you're low budget, now you're attracting a certain type of thing, you're making a movie for a studio for a certain type of category that doesn't allow for the nuance of a Stand By Me. And so I feel like, of course the good movies were the non-supernatural movies.
And that's why no one knows there's Stephen King.
Yeah, and that's the other side of that, yeah.
I can offer a slight pushback on that.
Okay.
In the case of The Shining, which does remain a supernatural horror film,
Yeah, that's
but in every other case you are correct.
Yeah.
Here's my pitch for Maximum Overdrive. being brought back. So, all the trucks are Tesla automatic driving trucks. And Paul Verhoeven directs. And there's a tie-in to Fast and Furious franchise.
No, the tie-in is to the Terminator.
What if it's both?
Because the AIs are running the trucks.
What
It's
if we
like,
alien
yeah,
versus
come on.
predator this?
I was talking to someone a couple
Anyway.
weeks ago. Right now.
This is how the show gets made.
Our episode, when we record episodes, are usually like 2.5 hours long, and we just cut my shaking my head in silence. It comes down to about 90
That
minutes.
just fuels the podcast like
But,
your
I someone was recently saying to me that they believe that this issue, the closer Stephen King gets to his film adaptations, the worse they get, because if we think of it, that is how Stephen King actually views his work. And it's this weird thing where, like, he's a good writer only because his incorrectness about how it manifests itself works in words, but he's just actually so wrong about what the visual translation is, not as film, but outside of his ability to write words.
Right, which is quite paradoxical when you consider the cinematic nature of his writing. He often structures things like shots that are done with a camera, and yet it cannot be adapted straight from what he says. Yeah.
That's all I have.
Anybody else?
I wanted to touch on the point that they didn't turn him into a giant spider. And we were both like, we had two fears about this adaptation. Are they going to have the grade school orgy, and are they going to have the giant
that
spider?
scene.
That's
And
Oh,
like,
which we didn't talk about.
why do you think I had to say something?
Yeah, I guess right at the end. Yeah, we're done.
All right, good. We're done then. Thanks, bye.
I think we owe a particular debt to the Lord of the Rings movies because everybody saw the fight with Shelob. They're not going to sit through it again, and
Fair enough. I
they can't
agree,
bring
yeah.
it in.
Can't do that again.
Gangbang Lord of the Rings?
I don't remember.
In my head, there was.
Maybe they can sneak it into chapter 2.
Oh, Mr. Frodo.
All right, thanks all you guys for coming. Thank you to Borderlands.